26 common relationship mistakes you commit in your marriage, a wholesome analysis. Hi friends, welcome to Marriage Realities, a comprehensive relationship channel. Today's video will be a wholesome analysis about the varied relationship mistakes you commonly make. Yes, unknown to you, you commit many relationship mistakes without understanding the devastating impact it creates to your married life. You must understand that marriage is a complicated relationship to you and to all couples. If you do not understand the nuances to make it work, you feel very unhappy with your marriage. The hardest part of marriage is dealing with emotions. Often, you do not understand the emotions of your spouse, and your spouse does not understand your emotions. When emotions are not respected, it creates unwanted tension in your relationship. You always emote anger, love, resentment, depression, tension and other multiple emotions towards your spouse. When your spouse understands your emotions and reacts to it in a caring manner, you feel loved and cared. But when your emotions are discarded by your spouse, you find your married life highly taxing to you. You combat with many types of emotions all through your married life. One day you're happy being married to your spouse. Yet another day, you curse your luck for being married to a person not at all suited to you. You must understand that your married life will always be about you and your spouse. You are the sole hero and heroine of your married life. But there are many villains in your married life, your relationship mistakes. You marry a spouse out of the intense love you have for him or her. But you make your marriage tough by committing many relationship mistakes which create tons of anger, bitterness and resentment between you. Many a time you are overwhelmed by the relationship problems you face with your spouse because it seems to grow in intensity as years go by. The drudgery of your daily routine, your never-ending family responsibilities and your oppressive relationship problems overwhelms you. You often clash with your spouse for many unwanted reasons. You also face many relationship issues with your spouse. Your married life puts loads of duties on your already stooping shoulders. More than your family duties, your day-to-day existence with your spouse is very predictable and very mundane. You feel your spouse is not the same person you imagined him or her to be before your marriage. After living with your spouse for a few years, you find many qualities about him or her annoying and irritating to you. When you understand that your dreamy expectations of your spouse will never happen, you're able to swallow your disappointments and live through your married life. But sadly, this never happens in most marriages. You take your disappointments about your spouse too much to your heart. You had always assumed that your married life would be rosy and idealistic. You had also complacently assumed that your marriage will work on its own. All your assumptions are proved wrong when things between you and your spouse never happens as you imagined it to be. When you do not nurture your relationship with your spouse, your marriage will only be plagued with multiple issues and problems. You're all the more dejected when you face all sorts of relationship issues throughout your married life. You never had in your wildest dreams expected relationship problems with your spouse. You face money-related issues in your married life. You face compatibility issues with your spouse. You face relationship issues centered around your in-laws. When the compatibility ratio is high in your married life, you easily overcome the relationship issues you face with your spouse. But when you do not enjoy compatibility with your spouse, your relationship issues create wider and intense rifts between you. You must not allow your relationship issues to drive a wedge between you and your spouse. It is a harsh fact that relationship issues arises when you do not understand the mentality of your life partner. Husband does not understand the viewpoint of his wife. Wife does not understand the viewpoint of her husband. Husband has many habits which makes his wife feel annoyed and irritated. Many a time, wife feels that her husband is heartless and insensitive and that he does not understand her emotional needs. When husband continues to remain apathetic and unresponsive towards the sensitivity of his wife, she is emotionally shattered and upset. Wife also commits many mistakes. She has many habits which annoys her husband no end. Husband mostly feels that his wife is too demanding, too nagging, too emotional, too clinging and too boring. So, it is a fact that both do not understand what the other expects from him or her. You're that concentrated on your own emotions that you feel your spouse is always in the wrong and that you are always in the right. You commit many relationship mistakes that tear your married life into shreds. These relationship mistakes are emotionally draining and mentally demanding. Shall we now have a look at some of the 26 common relationship mistakes you often make? The number one relationship mistake is having great expectations about your spouse. Your expectations about your spouse are always based on your dreams you had about him or her before your marriage. You enter your married life loaded with great expectations, dreaming that everything you imagine about your spouse will now become a reality. But you are in for a shock after your marriage. Your marriage is not what you expected it to be. Your spouse is not what you expected him or her to be. There are many qualities about your spouse not to your liking. Your spouse also has many habits you find impossible to adjust with. You're dismayed that your spouse is no longer as loving as he or she was before your marriage. You find that after your marriage, your spouse makes you accountable towards all the issues in your family. You feel strung up when your spouse loads you with unending responsibilities while he or she has it good. You do not seem to have anything to talk with your spouse after a few years of marriage. Your dreamy expectations about your marriage comes crashing to your feet. When nothing happens according to your dreams, you now feel that your married life is not good enough for you. When your dreams about your marriage is unrealistic, it's only to be expected that it will not happen in reality. The number two relationship mistake is wanting to change your spouse according to your liking. You feel you can be happy in your relationship only when your spouse acts in a way you like. So, you force your spouse to change according to your way of thinking. When you force your spouse to change according to your liking, your self-centered attitude does not go well with him or her. Your spouse feels that you're selfish and concentrated on your own whims and desires, that you want him or her to change his or her identity. The number three relationship mistake is behaving indifferently towards your spouse. Indifference kills your marriage. When you're indifferent towards your spouse, he or she withdraws further and further away from you. It is only natural that your spouse wants you to support and protect him or her during his or her low times. But sadly, you do not even notice that your spouse is feeling down and out. You go about your work as though the emotions of your spouse do not matter to you. When you act indifferent and apathetic towards your spouse, you only make him or her drift away from you. Behaving selfishly has a tremendous negative and emotionally draining impact in your relationship. Your indifferent attitude towards your spouse could literally kill your marriage. When you're indifferent towards your spouse, he or she withdraws further and further away from you. The number four relationship mistake is holding yourself away from family issues. When you do not understand that family responsibilities are mutual commitment between you and your spouse, you coolly hold yourself away from family issues. When you act as though family problems is not your business, you're only making your spouse feel emotionally devastated and crushed for being in a relationship which is completely one-sided. When you make your relationship one-sided by being a mere spectator to your family problems, your spouse finds it impossible to be happy. When you act as though your spouse is the only one responsible to fulfill all family duties, he or she feels overwhelmed by the magnitude of the family responsibilities thrust on his or her shoulders. When you constantly accuse your spouse as the sole reason behind all your family issues, he or she is naturally enraged by your audacity. You must understand that family duties will always be a combined responsibility between you and your spouse. Every family problem will be a mutual commitment between both. Unless there is mutual sharing and mutual commitment between you, you cannot enjoy your marriage. When family responsibilities are shared mutually between you, it makes both come emotionally closer to each other. The number five mistake is stopping to act romantic towards your spouse. Most marriages suffer from the non-existence of romance in the relationship. When there is no romance in your relationship, both feel bored with your married life. Romance enlivens your married life that much. What does romance exactly mean in marriage? Romance is displaying the love you have for your spouse in a passionate manner so that he or she feels it intensely. But it is sad that most of you stop being romantic towards your spouse after a few years of your married life. You get so used to your spouse that you stop displaying your love for him or her. You become somewhat nonchalant and offhand towards your spouse. When romance bids goodbye from your married life, boredom makes an easy entry into your relationship. You must embed romance into your married life if you must enjoy it. The number six relationship mistake is lack of transparency. Lack of transparency is yet another relationship mistake you constantly make in your marriage. When there is no transparency in your married life, everything between you becomes shrouded with secrecy. You often behave needlessly hiding and mysterious towards your spouse. You often indulge in being needlessly hiding and mysterious in your relationship. When you become secretive towards your spouse, your married life becomes needlessly tense and worrying. But when you're frank with your spouse about your decisions and your plans, he or she feels relaxed and comfortable living with you. You do not feel tense and doubtful about what your spouse is doing with his or her life. Transparency makes your married life that much free from unwanted tension you might otherwise feel when secrecy shrouds your relationship. Number 7 relationship mistake is lack of emotional intimacy. When you are not emotionally intimate with your spouse, he or she no longer feels protected and cherished by you. When your spouse is unable to share emotions with you, he or she feels depressed about the inability to share the bottled up emotions. On the contrary, when you and your spouse are able to share your emotions with each other, both feel cherished and treasured. Both feel light and breezy in your married life as both are not compelled to hide your emotions. This sort of emotion sharing between you makes you enjoy your relationship. Number 8 relationship mistake is extramarital affairs. It is strange that you destroy your marriage for something so fickle as an extramarital affair. When you're physically or emotionally attracted to another person, you're ready to cheat your spouse. You have fun with the person you're attracted to, forgetting the destruction you're causing to your marriage. Your spouse finds it near impossible to forgive you when you cheat his or her trust in you. When you're loyal to your spouse, you will never ever imagine to cheat him or her. As your extramarital affair will eventually destroy your marriage, it is no use cursing yourself for having been a fool to lose your family for a relationship so fickle and transitory. Number 9 relationship mistake is being toxic. When you behave toxic, your spouse feels the heat of your toxicity in all phases of his or her relationship with you. When you display behaviors which makes your spouse feel uncomfortable, unhappy and miserable, it is a definite sign that you're being toxic. You're doing it all wrong in behaving toxic towards your spouse. Your spouse is your life partner and not your enemy that you should emit negative toxic behavior towards him or her. You should avoid being toxic towards your spouse at any cost. You should understand that when you continue to behave in a toxic manner with your spouse, he or she would never tolerate it for long. Your toxicity could end your marriage. So, avoid it at any cost. Number 10 relationship mistake is being emotionally disconnected with your spouse. Emotional disconnection between you works havoc in your relationship. When your spouse is unable to share his or her feelings with you, it creates lots of needless unhappiness in him or her. When the emotions and feelings of your spouse is discarded by you, your marriage suffers from complete emotional disconnection between you. When you do not spend quality time with your spouse, you become more like roommates, living in the same house just because you're married. This is not how your marriage should be. Sadly, this is how your marriage is. Most of you live in the same house but more like strangers. You do your thing and your spouse does his or her thing. This sort of a scenario will only intensify the emotional disconnection between you. You cannot hope for emotional well-being in your marriage when you're emotionally disconnected with your spouse. Number 11 relationship mistake is having midlife crisis. Many a time, midlife crisis is also a grave relationship issue in your married life. Through the many years of your marriage, your anger, your disappointments, your differences towards your spouse erupts as a volcanic force. You feel distressed that you have lost the prime of your life for a relationship which had nothing for you. You become resentful that your spouse has leached everything good in you and had sucked all your energy from you. As you enter your middle age, you feel you have had enough. You now have all sorts of doubts about your relationship with your spouse. Your anger that your spouse has taken advantage of your love makes you feel bitter and resentful against him or her. Your disappointments against your spouse also increases in volume as you age. There are many couples who enjoy their relationship more as they age, because the love for each other has grown along with the age. Mostly, midlife crisis occurs in a relationship which is one-sided, wherein you had to bear the brunt of family duties while your spouse had it good. Whatever might be the reason behind the midlife crisis in your marriage, you should not let it ruin your relationship. Of course, you cannot be the only one to be all sacrificing and all responsible. You must definitely make your spouse realize his or her family duties. Number 12 relationship mistake is continuous fights and arguments between you. Fights and arguments are common relationship issues most couples face. Before your marriage, you assume that you will never fight and argue with your spouse. But after your marriage, you are taken aback when you differ from your spouse in many ways, and you fight with your spouse about it. Frequent fights and arguments between you make you feel that your marriage is not working as you dreamed it. You're wrong in feeling so. You must understand that fights and arguments are part and parcel of any marriage. Even the most compatible couples fight and argue. The only difference being couples who understand each other never take the fights to the extreme of making them feel bitter against each other. So, when you're compatible with your spouse, you two fight and argue, but only for a short while. Your relationship is back to normal as your love makes you forget your bitterness easily. But when you do not enjoy compatibility with your spouse, you fight and argue for almost everything, and you allow your bitterness to intrude into your relationship. It is a harsh fact that emotions run high when you argue and fight with your spouse. But after your fight is over, all you feel is remorse and guilt. If only you had paused for a second, you could have avoided needless fights and arguments between you. When there are continuous arguments in your relationship, you're emotionally upset that you married a person not at all suited to you. Number 13 relationship mistake is outgrowing your spouse. When you outgrow your spouse, you only become blind to his or her good aspects. When you become ignorant about the good qualities of your spouse, you will fail to cherish him or her. Outgrowing your spouse converts you into being indifferent and unappreciative towards your spouse. Number 14 relationship mistake is ignoring the sexual needs of your spouse. Sexless marriage is yet another emotionally draining relationship issue in many marriages. Sex is something so personal between you and your spouse. Sex gives you excitement and makes you expand as a family. But there are many couples who suffer from a sexless marriage. Why does this have to happen to many marriages? In today's modern world, your life has become hectic and chaotic. You run around in search of money. Your heavy workload, your work-related pressures, the relationship issues you face with your spouse makes you preoccupied and worried. When you face such outside pressures in your life, having sex with your spouse becomes a distant thought to you. So, your initial excitement in lovemaking gradually fades away as you become anxious about the ways to deal with the many problems you're facing in your family. Sexless marriage can prove to be quite a big relationship issue if your spouse has a need for physical intimacy. Number 15 relationship mistake is lack of communication. You had so much to talk with your spouse before your marriage. You seem to have nothing to talk with your spouse after your marriage. Whenever you interact with your spouse, you talk about family problems, money issues, repayments, and other family-related problems. These are all confrontational topics which invariably provokes angry reactions from both. Unless you communicate your feelings and emotions with your spouse, a definite drift will happen between you. Number 16 relationship mistake is lack of empathy. You can truly understand your spouse only when you're empathetic. When you're empathetic, you understand your spouse from his or her viewpoint. But when you're not empathetic, you'll be selfish about your own thoughts and feelings. Unless you understand the feelings and emotions of your spouse from his or her angle, there can be no true happiness in your relationship. Number 17 relationship mistake is comparing your spouse. When you're not satisfied with your spouse, you make the grave blunder of comparing him or her with your friends, colleagues, or relatives. When you compare your spouse with others, you send a clear message to him or her that you find your spouse lacking and not according to your liking. You should understand that when you compare your spouse with others, it brings tons of resentment and bitterness into your relationship. Always love your spouse for what he or she is. Comparing your spouse with others will do you no good. Number 18 relationship mistake is snooping on your spouse. When you become suspicious about your spouse, you start to snoop on him or her. You read the messages of your spouse with the unwanted intent of finding his or her misdoings. You check the whereabouts of your spouse in a suspicious manner. You ask many doubtful questions to your spouse with the deliberate intention of catching him or her red-handed. Unless you trust your spouse, you cannot have a moment of happiness in your married life. Your snooping attitude could tear your marriage into shreds. Number 19 relationship mistake is making degrading comments about your spouse. When you make degrading comments about your spouse in the presence of your family, friends, relatives, it creates unwanted tension in your relationship. Your spouse feels bitter against you when you degrade him or her. You should understand that the hurting words you carelessly utter cannot be taken back. It remains etched in the mind of your spouse forever. Your words leave a scar of anger and bitterness in your spouse. Continuously degrading your spouse could one day destroy your marriage. You garner nothing from degrading your spouse, so avoid it at any cost. Number 20 relationship mistake is emotional cheating. Most of you feel that physical cheating is the only way you can cheat your spouse. No. You're wrong if you feel so. Many a time you also cheat your spouse emotionally. When you're too friendly with the opposite sex without your spouse being clueless about you, it is emotional cheating in its worst form. When you discuss the personal issues between you and your spouse with another person, it is also emotional cheating. When you confide your decisions and plans about life with another person, not with your spouse, it is also emotional cheating. Though you're not cheating your spouse physically, you're cheating him or her emotionally. Number 21 relationship mistake is not giving personal space to your spouse. You might love your spouse to the skies. It gives you no right to demand all the time of your spouse 24/7. You must understand that your spouse is an individual with his or her own unique traits and desires. It is the prerogative of your spouse to enjoy his or her own space without you intruding into it. When you cling on to your spouse in the name of love, he or she does not like it at all. In fact, your spouse feels jailed being married to you. But when you give your spouse the personal space due to him or her, he or she feels happy and relaxed living with you. Number 22 relationship mistake is social media addiction. Addiction to social media is destroying many relationships. You have many friends in your social media account. You chat with them, share personal pictures with them, mostly without your spouse being clueless about it. You spend more time in social media than with your spouse. Unless you limit your social media usage, it could destroy your married life. Number 23 relationship mistake is discouraging your spouse. Often you have no encouraging words for your spouse. When the morale of your spouse is down, you further aggravate the feeling of lacking of your spouse by uttering many discouraging words. What you do not understand is your discouraging words crushes the morale of your spouse. Number 24 relationship mistake is taking your spouse for granted. Most of you take your spouse for granted. You feel that your spouse is only doing his or her family duty and that there's nothing to appreciate about it. So you overlook the contribution of your spouse as only duties allotted to him or her. When you take your spouse for granted, he or she does not like it at all. Number 25 relationship mistake is having ego clashes. Ego clashes does nothing to your marriage except make you feel unhappy. You have ego clashes with your spouse only when you feel that you're superior to him or her. You're wrong in feeling that you're one up on your spouse. You should understand that you're in the same team and both play equally crucial role in making your relationship work. Number 26 relationship mistake is not apologizing. It is a normal scenario to have relationship issues with your spouse. It is natural you feel angry with your spouse on many relationship issues. Many a time you two do many things that hurt the feelings of your spouse. Though it is normal to fight and argue with your spouse, the biggest blunder you commit is not apologizing for the wrong you did. When you do not apologize to your spouse for the hurt you inflicted, his or her anger against you remains vivid and raw. But when you apologize, the anger and resentment of your spouse disappears instantly without getting stored in his or her mind. Can you see the multiple relationship mistakes you commonly make? You make these relationship blunders without realizing the devastating impact it has in your married life. But the utmost relationship mistake you make is opting for divorce at the drop of the hat. Divorce has become that much of a trend in modern marriages. When you face relationship issues in your married life, you feel that you're unlucky to be married to a person not at all suited to you. Instead of solving your relationship problems or avoiding your relationship mistakes, you opt to divorce your spouse. You often cite many reasons behind your divorce. But in your intense anger to settle scores with your spouse, you forget the emotional trauma your children are undergoing. Your divorce makes your children emotionally shattered and crushed. You do not understand that your divorce will leave a trail of emotionally devastated children, your depleted finance and dejected mindset. You might think that divorce offers you the best solution to end all your relationship troubles. In fact, it is the starting point to all sorts of troubles in your life. It is rather alarming that divorce has become the most commonly uttered word among modern couples. It is so easy to let go your marriage than to make it work. So, you must do everything to save your marriage from ending in the divorce court. When you save your marriage, you also save your life from tears and remorse. You also give your children the blessing of a united family. What should you do to avoid these relationship mistakes from happening in your married life? You should first understand the reality of your marriage. Most of you have great dreams about your married life. When you marry, you dream that you'll live a happily ever after life with your spouse. You have all sorts of rosy dreams that your love days will continue forever. Your initial day of marriage proved your thoughts right, as you could not have enough of each other. But as days go by, you commit many relationship mistakes quoted above. Though you make relationship mistakes, you blame your spouse as the reason behind it. You must understand the reality of marriage if you must avoid committing these relationship mistakes. You should understand that a marriage without relationship issues does not exist for any couple. A marriage without problems and issues for couples exists only in fairy tales. In reality, your married life will never be a fairy tale. Your marriage will be more like a lengthy novel with many pages of happiness, excitement, tears, anger, and many more feelings and emotions. The fairy tale words of happily living ever after will always be replaced by living responsibly ever after. Without understanding this reality, it is sad that you marry in haste and also divorce in haste. It is indeed sad that your relationship which started with love should end bitterly in a divorce court. When you do not understand the real intensity of what your marriage means to you, you will not nurture your relationship. You must understand that making your marriage work needs tremendous input of love and care from both you and your spouse. Do not ever expect a problem-free marriage because it does not exist anywhere in this world. Do not search for a perfect spouse. A perfect spouse does not exist anywhere in this world. Do not have rosy dreams about your married life. In reality, you will face tons of relationship issues in your day-to-day life with your spouse. Many a time you will feel depressed that your spouse is not what you expected him or her to be. There will be times when you will be alarmed by the overload of family duties thrust on you. This sort of emotional confusion happens in almost all marriages. Your married life becomes beautiful and meaningful only when there is mutual respect and care between you. But you let the many issues you face in your relationship to wreck your marriage. Your indifferent attitude turns your dreamed happily ever after relationship lackluster and dull. The distance between you and your spouse widens so much so that you drift too far away from each other. You wonder whether you really know your spouse as much as you thought you did, as he or she becomes so isolated from you. You're time and again emotionally shattered when your married life is nothing short of a mental torture to you. You might now be wondering about the ways to make your relationship enjoyable to you. You must do everything you can to overcome the niggling relationship issues from your married life. You must emit qualities that breathe fresh oxygen of happiness into your married life. The positive qualities you practice will definitely make your relationship enjoyable to you and your spouse. Unconditional love makes your relationship a happy experience to you. You should instantly and spontaneously support your spouse when he or she is feeling low and dejected. Always be frank and open with your spouse. Be transparent and never hide any secrets from your spouse. Do not do anything that will make you lose the trust of your spouse. As you know, it is tough to build trust into your marriage. It is a fact that it takes years before you or your spouse implicitly trust each other. But you can lose trust in a relationship with a click of your fingers. One wrong word, one wrong action, one wrong attitude could kill the trust your spouse has in you. A marriage without trust is like a body without life. Your marriage cannot be revived and it cannot survive the lack of trust. Yet another relationship quality you drastically need is emotional connection between you and your spouse. When you're emotionally connected with your spouse, you will never overlook him or her. Overlooking and ignoring your spouse is dangerous to your married life. On the contrary, when you're emotionally connected, you will constantly send the message, "I'm here for you," to your spouse. Your spouse also has this message of love for you. This message of love and support is drastically needed in your married life. Emotional intelligence is yet another beautiful quality your marriage drastically needs. When love, care, empathy are the predominant emotions you display towards your spouse, it signifies that you're using your emotions intelligently. There are times your spouse might argue unreasonably with you. When you're emotionally intelligent, you will realize that your spouse is just having a bad day and that he or she is not displaying hatred or bitterness towards you. Encouragement from your spouse is something you constantly look for when you're facing many pressures all around you. You want your spouse to encourage you when you're facing loads of work-related issues. You want your spouse to encourage you when all your endeavors for success meets with failures. You want your spouse to be encouraging when in worst case you lose your job. Care, emotional protectiveness, empathy, sympathy and affection for your spouse are all constructive emotions your marriage drastically needs. In fact, your marriage cannot do without these emotions. But sadly, these emotions are mostly ignored and underplayed by you in your married life. Hatred, bitterness, hostility, indifference towards your spouse, and resentment against him or her are all very negative and destructive emotions. But sadly, you let these negative emotions dominate your relationship with your spouse. This is the reason you feel very unhappy in your married life. When you wake up at the earliest and stop committing these relationship mistakes, you can save your marriage from being destroyed. Did you like this comprehensive and wholesome analysis about the mistakes you make in your marriage? Marriage Realities will have many such relationship eye-openers. Subscribe to my channel to understand your marriage in a new light. Press the bell icon for updates about my latest relationship videos. Make love forever until death do us part your relationship goal.